Support for this episode comes from the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. Applications and nominations are now open for the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. The Diller Awards honor up to 15 Jewish teens from across the United States with an award of $36,000 each to recognize their impact and leadership to repair the world. Nominate a teen leader today, or they can apply directly by January 8th, 2026. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org. This is Judaism Unbound, Episode 508, Door to Door, Episode 1, A House for a Life. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and today our Judaism Unbound episode for the week is the first episode of one of the podcasts in our Judaism Unbound family of podcasts, Door to Door, A Pilgrimage Across Generations, a podcast conceived by and hosted by Miriam Turlinchamp, our executive director and fearless leader. I'll say a little bit more to ground us in this podcast in just a second, but before I do, this week's Judaism Unboundments. We want to encourage all of you who are listening to join our newly public Discord. We've had a Discord server for a little while now, but we launched it at first as a very small group, then grew it to yeshiva students who have taken our classes, and now we want to open it up to any of our listeners, anybody out there who feels called to join it. We have a Discord server that you can join via discord.judaismunbound.com. This is a way for you to connect with other Judaism Unbound listeners. We have a whole slew of different channels where you can talk about topics of relevance to our show, share resources, organizations you like that are connected to our work, and also just schmooze a little bit with other people. There's been incredible conversations happening there, and we hope that you will join them. Again, just head to discord.judaismunbound.com. And now, some background on the podcast we're featuring this week, Door to Door, A Pilgrimage Across Generations, hosted by Miriam Turlinchamp. Door to Door is a deeply personal 5-part podcast series tracing one Jewish family's multi-generational pilgrimage from a once-lost home in Germany to the present-day echoes of inherited memory, trauma, and resilience. Told through archival recordings, family reflections, and emotional returns to ancestral ground, this podcast chronicles the survival of Simon, a Holocaust survivor taken to Buchenwald Concentration Camp during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and the generations that followed him. It's a story shaped by suffering, but defined by rebuilding, remembrance, and an enduring commitment to legacy. Door to Door invites listeners to witness what it means to reclaim identity from the wreckage, and to carry forward the names, the stories, and the truths nearly erased. Without further ado, here's the first episode of Door to Door, A Pilgrimage Across Generations. The episode is entitled, A House for a Life.
Of course we were going to go. It's my family's history. It's my grandfather's legacy.
Welcome to Door, a multi-generational story of memory, trauma, and identity. I'm Miriam Turlinchamp. In this 5-episode series, we follow how my family, over 4 generations, metabolized a history of survival, trauma, and hope, and reclaimed a story nearly erased. This is Episode 1, A House for a Life. We step out of the train station and begin to walk into town. By now, walking on cobblestones with the weight of our backpacks feels like a habit. After weeks of rolling through Europe, London, Amsterdam, Rome, Barcelona, travel feels natural. So too does this small town just outside of Frankfurt, Germany, whose name we've heard repeated all of our lives. Wachenbuchen.
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 A picture of the village hung on the walls of our grandfather's home. Right next to the picture of a black and white Stoic family picture from the early 1900s, and beside that, a blurry photo of young children being deported to a concentration camp. My sister Julie and I find the house easily. After all, we've seen it in pictures 1,000 times. Neither one of us has been here before, and also, part of us has never left this place. Our mother Nadine and Uncle Gary traveled here when they were our age. Our cousins Mark, Shane, and Marika had been here too. And so it feels like it's our turn to knock on the door. Here is my sister Julia.
Of course we were going to go. Yeah, it was never even a question. Of course we'd go. Like, it's my family's history. It's my grandfather's legacy. There was never a question.
each one in our own generation, knocking on a door that hasn't opened for us since it was stripped from our family. On Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, our grandfather Simon was picked up by the Gestapo in Frankfurt, Germany, and transported to Buchenwald Concentration Camp.
I was employed by one of the large international export house in Frankfurt am Main. The name was L.S. Mayer. They had both branches in New York, London, and South America. I continued working in that company until Kristallnacht in 1938. I used to stay with an aunt in Frankfurt. I never came back to Wachenbuchen except on weekends. At that particular point, the morning of Kristallnacht, I did not know what was going on in my hometown in Wachenbuchen. The Nazis broke in, lined up all the Jewish employees of that company. The non-Jews pointed out everybody who was Jewish. Were shipped or sent to the railroad station in Frankfurt am Main, which is a very large town. There, every Jew the Nazis could get hold of were assembled there. It was a beginning of atrocities, because the underlings of the Nazis tried to prove their patriotism by beating up the Jews, and anybody who stood in front got a taste of the new Nazi power. From there, we were transported to Buchenwald in large train.
At the time, there were ways one could buy their way out of the camps. Of course, a Jew couldn't handle money due to the Nuremberg laws in place, so it wasn't simple. But my great-grandmother Jenny found a way. Here's my mother, Nadine.
My father's mother sold the house so that he could have money to get out of Germany.
She sold her home, the one that had been in the family for generations, and bought Simon a one-way ticket out of Germany, immediately displacing herself. This is my cousin Shane.
And the fact that Grandma Jenny sold the house under duress, and people took advantage of that situation back then. I'm sure whoever bought it got a great deal on that house.
A house for a life. But really, a life for a life, with a house's collateral damage. Simon survived. Jenny was sent to Auschwitz. We don't know the story for a long time. And even after we learn it, the story continues to unfold. Julia, again.
And the story wasn't over when he went into a concentration camp, not for my family.
Each generation adding new information, unlocking new mysteries, and trying its best to weave something whole out of a family history shredded by trauma. For most of my grandfather's life, the story lives in pristine frames. In the name Simon gives his children, and in stolen snippets of memory shared almost accidentally.
It was later in life. I mean, he didn't really talk about it that much.
It came out in little spurts. It was not like, let's sit down and talk about it. It was small things that I think he had memory of.
I think ultimately it was interesting that my grandpa took this journey, his post-traumatic journey from being repressed and never speaking about it for 30 plus years to getting to a point in his life where he openly shared his story with pretty much anyone who was willing to listen.
Here's my mother, Nadine.
I grew up in a time when the stories of the Holocaust were very much present. He was interviewed for the Schindler Project. There was no shortage of literature about the Holocaust. And there were studies at the time about children of Holocaust survivors. So we all knew them. It's very much part of our everyday life in a way that many other families probably had their own stories. Children of those who were incarcerated during World War II, the Japanese families. I think it was more like that. I don't think there was a moment of trauma. It was more that it seeped through our lives in many small ways.
Our mother and her siblings grew up in the shadow of missing lineage.
I remember being with him and saying, I'm bored, I don't know what to do, in the same way many 10-year-olds do or 11-year-olds do. And he said, very unusually, because he did not talk about his story until the latter part of his life. He said, well, let me see, what was I doing at your age? And then he kind of recounted what life was like for Jews in a very simple, matter-of-fact way. But it certainly gave me pause for thought that stayed with me. He did not belabor it. It was more subtle in the way that we spent money or didn't spend money, who we engaged with, how we practiced our communal life.
Each of Simon's children chased after these stories that were so opaque in their childhood. Each, in their own way, set out to discover the lost pieces of legacy, reclaim disappeared ancestors, and pay homage to the price of survivorship, ultimately finding themselves standing in front of the door of their father's childhood home, as if called into sacred pilgrimage to both remember and reclaim a story that is both uniquely Simon's and also an integral part of every single one of our identities. Nadine, again.
It's kind of like asking why you go to Mecca. That was sort of our focal points. We've heard so much about Wachenbuchen and about my father's experience, and it was an homage, I suppose. And I did visit with the family that was a neighbor, but the entire time I was there was the neighbor across the street on the balcony crying because I was something, I think, like a ghost from the past.
When Simon endured indentured servitude, starvation, humiliation, and torture in Buchenwald, he couldn't have known how he would tell his story and to whom. Yet after the worst moments in his life, the murder of his entire extended family, the burning of his school, the loss of his home, his country, his way of being, there would be a wife and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each in their own way, always knowing that his story was part of our own. This is his granddaughter, Jennifer.
Like the first time I laid eyes on him, I knew that all this had happened. I mean, I don't remember a time when I didn't know that was his experience.
And his eldest daughter, Davida.
I've always heard it. I think in part it had to do with the pictures hanging in our house forever, the one of his house. I always knew this story. I don't know exactly when, but I always knew. The earliest memory I have of the more complete story was when Nadine invited him to speak at the Hebrew Day School where y'all were going. I heard it, and that's when I heard a more complete story than he had ever imparted before.
When you've known part of your story for all of your life, it's natural to want to know more. Each of us making our own pilgrimage to the place, the small house in Wachenbuchen, Germany, to stand at the threshold and say,
here I am, and you didn't knock us all out, because he made it. There's a whole family that is in existence because of that. So there was a whole lot of righteousness, I suppose, involved with it. And there was a certain pleasure in seeing that neighbor be upset, because I believe it was a neighbor, one of those people who took advantage of Jews who had to leave very quickly and either just took those houses or bought it very much on the cheap. We now know what happened to those houses. They sold the houses, but they didn't realize they had to leave, and they got what they could get.
Each of us has a version of reconciling the concept of we're still here, and those that took advantage of our suffering are also still here. And in between those two statements, just this year, 87 years after the house was taken, the city placed Stoppelstein, memory stones, in front of the door. Here is my sister Julia on a trip in October 2024 to Frankfurt.
I walked a lot in Frankfurt and I started taking pictures. I started coming across, they're called stumbling stones in English, came across all these stumbling stones and just really made me really think. I took a picture of 6 stones in front of a Kentucky Fried Chicken and just thinking about, imagine being in Cincinnati, right? And your kid's just walking into a Dairy Queen. And if you had walked across these something like stumbling stones and knowing that there was a deep history there, that there was a personal connection to like what had happened to the family that lived in what is now a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And it is so incredible. Like, I don't know how many people know that's what they were walking across. Next time I'm going to go to Germany, my eyes are thinking I'm going to be totally wide open to seeing this city and the community in a very, very different light, and to think more thoughtfully about where I'm walking and what does that meant for the generations before me and what they experienced. And knowing that legacy is now in Wachenbuchen from generations to come, like how powerful that is.
And my mother, Nadine.
Aspiring to put markers at these places that you can't avoid because they're where you walk. These stones, you can't avoid them. There are first-person statements that are etched into sidewalks on the way to places. The German government, during that era when all of that happened, was saying, yes, this happened and never again. So for those of us who are descendants, to go and pay that visit and say, we see it, we acknowledge it, we so appreciate it, we support you. How can we participate? And then as our voices, as descendants, are strong.
And my cousin, Mindy.
There was never a headstone. There was never a monument for his grandmother. And he thought that at least, the Stapelstein was something. And then when he saw that little stone, it was a little thing, but it made it feel like, yes, she's remembered. They're remembered. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we have with the Holocaust. All these people died. Who remembers it? Who remembers the Holocaust in totality? But it's the individuals. Each of them had to go through that.
Here's Dr. Sarah Crane, visiting professor in the Judaics program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Cincinnati and the scholar in residence at the Cincinnati Holocaust and Humanities Center.
Memorials have a duty to give us a space that we wouldn't have in our lives otherwise. I mean, I think this is also what's so interesting about the Stolpersteine, the stepping stones in Berlin, is that I had one right outside of my apartment when I lived in Berlin. I had one right outside of my apartment when I lived in Frankfurt. And it was part of my daily life that I would see this stone right outside of my door. And what it did for me was did create like a little space to kind of reflect and remember, even in my kind of daily life. And I think this is something that memorials do very well. But also the fact that I saw it every day kept it relevant.
This is Herr Herbert Biegemann, who leads the effort of organizing the Stapelstein in Frankfurt and was a longtime pen pal of Simon's.
Es ist immer ein Ausnahmefall. Das heißt, Sie haben hier.
The area where I lived is called Maintal. It's 4 villages thrown together, including Simon's family's village of Wachenbuchen. In Maintal, there are 85 Stapelstein, stepping stones. About 60 of them are in the area of Wachenbuchen, where Miriam's family is from. And the majority of people just walk by and over and on, step on them, and no one really thinks about it.
Stepping stones, memorial markers, golden bits on the ground saying something happened here. Stop. Remember. One for Jenny. One for Simon. One for each of Simon's brothers, Lou and Ernst. It took 87 years to have a memorial, a name for what happened in the place where it happened. In October 2024, 3 generations, 11 people from our family traveled to stand at the threshold. In our own impossibility, our own miracle of continued lineage, and pay homage to the place where the ultimate sacrifice was paid for freedom and safety. Here's Julia.
I'm in Wachenbuchen now, about to turn left on Rubenberg Strasse. And we're walking to the Strauss family residence now. There's quite a lot of us. We have students from the high school here who've done research on
the survivors and their families. Which has been kind of weird to listen to kids read it as just a normal biography of someone from the past when it's someone that you're so connected to, which was definitely hard to hear, but also very sweet intentions and nice to see a new generation continue to learn.
Why does each family member choose to make a pilgrimage to the childhood home and not to the concentration camp? Maybe because it's where life happened, not the worst of the trauma.
Then it never entered my mind not to go. It's just, that's where you go.
This is my cousin, Marika.
I'm already sharing stories with my daughter, and bringing her to Germany will be an important part of her understanding her lineage, her story, the intergenerational trauma that exists within our family, and being able to allow her to touch and be and experience on those lands where such atrocities happened is going to be part of her story and part of how she hopefully is able to, live in the world in this change-making kind of way that I feel like my grandpa gave me.
It's not that I don't want to go to Buchenwald. I definitely do. We go to that house. We make the pilgrimage to his house because his story obviously is far beyond his months in the concentration camp. His story is the lead up to and the exodus from his before and after life when it comes to the Holocaust. So while the Holocaust, I think, played an outsized role in his life, I think we go to his house because that represents normalcy. That was what his life was and should have been versus the horrible events that led him and his mother and his uncles and his aunts and his cousins all to concentration camps and this horrific version of what became. So I think that's why we make that trip, because that's the real life. That's what it should have been. And that's what it was until it wasn't, unfortunately.
Or maybe out of the fantasy that the current residents would open the door and we'd embrace and somehow find a salve for the wound of hatred that still throbs within.
Anybody who wants to say it? Yiskadal, Yiskadash, Rabba, Be'almad, Tivara, Keruta, Yamdik, Mafuta, V'chayotim, V'chaye, Kechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala.
Somehow, he came out with a belief in kindness and forgiveness and dignity. And I think my relationship with my grandpa was formed around that. You look at the horrors and the atrocities from the Holocaust, and it would be perplexing to imagine, how does someone just find forgiveness, or find a way to live in the world without just, hate?
Amen. Amen.
And I asked my grandpa, I go, Grandpa, when you see Germans that are your age or around that time frame, do you ever wonder what they were doing during the 1930s and 1940s? Do you wonder if they were soldiers or secret police or SS? Do you ever think about that? Do you get angry and think about that? And he said, Shane, I don't think about that at all. Because if I thought hard about what that man was doing and I got angry and I hated that man for what he did, then they have won. And if I can look at that man and forgive him for whatever he may have done, then I have won. And that really stuck with me as a beautiful way to look at life, to have that capacity for forgiveness and understanding your own self, that love is so much more important than hate. It really stuck with me through my life.
Or maybe, as my sister says,
so if anything, it just opened the door of how much more we could learn about my family that we were told was totally erased and eradicated. That was the whole point. That was what the Nazis were trying to do, right? But talk about what strength there is in the power of the storytelling, right? Turns out that through all these new resources, there is a way to learn more and to tell an even more powerful story about what happened to our family members and to their community. I mean, it was very emotional to find out the adventure that waits of how many more questions I can now try to solve or seek out, and that our story wasn't over, that it wasn't going to be the same story, that we could add to it. And I don't think a lot of families are able to add to that story. And this trip opened the door for me to continue telling the story. It's not over.
When you are raised with a story that is so large that it will take generations to tell it with any justice, there's a point when the story ceases to be about one person during one particular time. Instead, it becomes integrated into our own stories and sense of self.
When I think about my grandpa, what I valued most about him was how he healed. It was truly one of the most beautiful things, and that I can't imagine actually. I never really got a chance to ask my grandpa about what that meant for his own healing journey, about his relationship to Germany and his story about the Holocaust. But for him to be able to come back to his homeland, and that was his one wish, right, is to pass along the story.
B46 für Ihre Anschlussflüge vielleicht ganz interessant. Ladies and gentlemen, we are disembarking on Terminal 1, B46, B46 for all passengers with connecting flights.
I knock. I knock again. There's no answer. None of us have been inside the house. But it's not the job of the house, or the current residents, or the neighbors to give us our story back, to fill the emptiness or bear witness to our thriving lineage.
And then I think the most emotional, and I really lost it at this point, was I just thought about how much I miss Grandpa. Like, just being around him and his stories. It's choking me up right now. It's just, it's just miss being around him and being at his house, getting to replay some of that in my mind and just reflect positively on what great experiences I had with him and the great relationship I was lucky enough to have with him well into adulthood. There was a mixture of grief and gratefulness that I felt when I was standing in front of his house. And a older German guy came by. He pedaled by as I was crying on the side of the wall. And I'm in my full running gear. And he said "Guten Morgen," and I oh. I had to. That kind of snapped me out of it a little bit, but it was I won't, I don't regret it or anything. It was this very emotional moment that I experienced out there.
It is our job to embody the story, opening up our own doors to possibility by declaring who we are in the face of this story, what we've been shaped by, and what restorative practices we will bring to the world as part of our own legacy. Ohio Humanities made this episode of Door to Door possible. Door to Door is a production of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future and part of the family of podcasts of Judaism Unbound. Created by Miriam Turlinchamp, directed by Joey Taylor, produced at Monastery Studios, original music by Rich Hordinsky, and art by Katie Kasner. Check the show notes for bonus material and resources. We'd love to hear from you. So you can email us at miriam@judaismunbound.com or find us at www.judaismunbound.com/door-to-door. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will explore pilgrimage as a response to trauma. Thanks for listening.